Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our online service. We have one of the most intriguing and well-known stories in the Old Testament to dive into and to explore today, the story of David and Bathsheba and Uriah. You saw the chosen reading flash up on the screen before we started. That's from 2 Samuel 11, verses 1 to 15. And it would be good to keep that piece of passage open so we can refer back to it as we move through the text. But just before we start with 2 Samuel 11, let's have a look at 1 Samuel chapter 8. Something very important in the life of the kings of Israel happens in 1 Samuel chapter 8. More importantly, something that sets the tone for what happens in our passage is also beginning to be revealed there. Because actions have consequences. They have consequences for kings, they have consequences for commanders, they have consequences for ordinary people, and they have consequences for collections of people and nations as well. And so this is why it's important. As the first book of Samuel starts, the people of Israel had come through a time of relative prosperity and success, military success against their enemies. They had established a nation state. All 12 tribes had become unified under the last of the judges, Samuel himself. Samuel is approaching old age, and so the people say to him, Samuel, tell the Lord, you are the Lord's appointed representative. Tell him, we don't want judges. We want a king. We want a king the way that all the nations around us have kings. We want one guy we can look to. One guy that can be your representative, or I should say God's representative among us on earth, and who can be our representative with God. The long and the short of it is, Samuel says, that's a terrible idea. You don't want a king. Let God be your king. Let God rule you. The people say, no, we want a king. And so the Lord speaks to Samuel. Samuel goes back to the people and says, you must know this. If you want a king, if you have a king, you must understand that this is what kings do. They take your sons, they make them fight and die in battle. They take your daughters to work as servants in their palaces. They take the best of your crops, the best of your livestock, the best of your servants. They take and take and take whatever they want because they have the power to do so, even more damningly because you have given them the power to do so, to take, to get, to change, to arrest, to apprehend, to intervene, and to exploit. In a funny, roundabout way that doesn't make sense to the Israelites then, but begins to make sense here in our passage quite a few years later. Samuel is warning the people that to have a king is to admit and to fully embrace the reality that actions have consequences. And to choose to have a human king who is fallible and who is given to his worst tendencies at all times is to step into that place where your actions have everlasting consequences. So, we've said that. We've said, importantly for what's going to happen next, that Samuel warns the people that kings take and take and take. Now, let's get back to our text, 2 Samuel 11, and just flesh out a few things that we need to understand as we move into the text. The first is that David and the house of David in the time we're reading from 2 Samuel was not a constitutional monarchy. That might be the form of monarchy that we are most that we are best associated and best familiar with now in the 21st century. Where there is a monarchy, you can think of the way that Britain has a monarchy, but they don't function as an absolute authoritarian ruler. They are there as a symbol of power and of heritage and of prestige, but they don't make or break or exploit the rules. In David's time, the monarchy was very, very different. The king was not some sideshow political figure The king was God's representative among the people and the people's representative with God. The king was the political, the religious, theological, the military, the social epicenter of all life, of all decision making. There really was, in David's time, no difference between the king's role as a theological leader, religious leader, head priest, if you will, and his role as a military commander. This is the role and the space that David himself inhabits. Which is to say that what we read, what happens next, is made all the more serious and all the more concerning for the trajectory that David puts the whole of the house of Israel on, because actions always have consequences. And so here we have David. He goes out onto his roof, what we could term, the way our houses are built, a balcony. We don't know what time of day it is. Interestingly, the Bible doesn't say that this happened at night, but we can assume that he walked out at some point. He was maybe lying down for a nap, afternoon nap, maybe at night, we don't know. Went out onto his balcony for a bit of a breeze and saw a woman bathing. He considered her very beautiful, sent his messengers, because that's what kings do, they have messengers to send, to inquire about her. The message comes back, she is Bathsheba. She is the daughter of Eliam. She is the wife of Uriah. In other words, according to the Old Testament laws recorded in the book of Exodus, she is accounted for as being the daughter of someone who is known and recorded, and being the wife. And of course, what we know about wives in the Old Testament, the property of Uriah the Hittite. In other words, Uriah was not an Israelite, he was a mercenary soldier fighting for Israel, but he was a Gentile. But this woman, Bathsheba, is known in relationship to the men in her life, as were all women in that time. But the message David is supposed to get is very clear. One, she's spoken for, she has a husband. Two, she has a father, and if you want to engage with her, you must do so via her father acting as some kind of proxy. But David doesn't do either of those things. He sends messengers to bring her to the temple. They take her from her home, bring her to the temple, and David takes her, and he lies down with her. Now, much has been written, and rightly so, about this act of taking her and laying with her and sleeping with her not being a consensual, romantic affair. This is coercive power. This is coercive masculine power at its worst. It is the power of a king or a high-ranking CEO, or dare I say, a member of parliament, getting what he wants from a low-ranking woman who is only known by her first name. Now, if that sounds familiar, and if it sounds relevant, it's because it is. This is what David, chosen representative of God, chosen representative of the people, is doing. And so they sleep together. Bathsheba departs. She lets him know, the timeline isn't given to us later on, that she's pregnant. And suddenly David has a problem. But he knows how to solve it. He lets Uriah come back from the battlefield. Uriah's fighting with the men, they're fighting the Ammonites. We can assume that if Uriah was stationed in Jerusalem, he would have been something of an elite soldier as well. Not just any infantryman, but an elite soldier, part of David's elite guard. He lets Uriah come back from the battlefield for some respite, comes into the palace, inquires about the battle and how it's going and how they're all doing. And then he thanks Uriah for giving such a good account. And he says, you know what, you're tired. Why don't you go home and lay down with your wife as a reward for your hard work? But again, Uriah the Hittite, the Gentile, the one who is not an Israelite, does not belong to this nation and family and people of God, does the righteous thing and only sleeps with the servants in the palace. The next day, David says, why did you do that? Uriah says, well, I can't let my brothers be fighting a war and then I go and sleep with my wife. I must maintain some sort of righteous piety and dignity. And so that night, David throws a big feast for him, gets him drunk, in the hope that that would encourage him to go home to lay with his wife. But not even that can discourage Uriah. And so on the next day, as he goes back to the battlefield, David sends this letter to Joab, his commander, saying, when the fighting is fiercest, put Uriah on the front lines and then pull back so that he may die. And that's where our passage ends. What I think we should do is just go back, and this is critically important to understanding this whole passage, to the first verse we have to read, 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. In the springtime, when kings go out to war, King David stayed at home. If you were here last week for the sermon about the prophets and about the shepherds of Israel, you would remember that we said one thing about the difference between a good and a bad shepherd. Good shepherds are out in the field with their flock. Bad shepherds tend to prefer the safety and the warmth of their huts and their fires and their shelters to being out in the elements. The same thing happens here. This is how it worked in David's time. Nations fought wars, almost endless wars, in the spring and the summer and the autumn. The people who stayed behind, the old and the young and the women, and in times of peace, you can imagine that the men did this as well. They tilled and plowed and sowed the fields, they maintained the livestock and the homes, but the fighting men went off to battle almost as a yearly seasonal cycle. Then you would return home in winter, because in winter, men out in military camps die of cold and disease. You'd go home for winter, look after your belongings, your property, your house, fix up a few things. Then come the springtime, you would be gathered up behind your king again and go out to fight whatever battle you hadn't concluded or whatever new battle was being fought. This was the cycle of life. And this is why the text helps us understand that in the springtime, when it is the custom of kings to go out in front of their armies to war, Israel did go to war with the Ammonites, but their king stayed at home, a shepherd who did not want to venture into the elements, but stay in the warmth and the safety and the comfort of his newly constructed palace. You see, David's downward spiral did not begin when he walked out onto his balcony and saw Bathsheba bathing. His downward spiral did not begin when he decided to effectively commit murder by having Uriah killed in battle. His downward spiral, it seems, began early in that spring when he sent his army to fight a war, but he stayed behind. But of course, this is what power does. This is what the power of powerful men, I should say, powerful people, does. Lord Acton, great Catholic historian and writer, is famous for saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, the second part of that quote is less well known, but it's just as striking. Great men are very often bad men, if not in their authority, then in their influence. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And thus great men are often bad men, if not by their authority, then by their influence. Something in David's character is not right. Something in what David does in these passages has to make us sit up and say, well, this is not exactly the conduct we expect of a king. Now, we won't spend too much time on this because we explore this in depth next week when God himself passes judgment on what David has done. But it is important to recognize the downward spiral that David goes on, that David is set upon by his refusal to go out to war with his armies. And if there is a lesson, if there is a moral lesson, and I'm not saying there is one in the story, it is perhaps one that prompts each of us to think about those times in our lives when we neglected to do one good thing At one time, we neglected to choose that one good thing and chose to do the other thing instead, and that set us on some kind of downward spiral where you end up making mistake after mistake after mistake, telling lie upon lie upon lie, cover up after cover up after cover up. Maybe if there is morality in the story, that is part of it, and it is connected to something that comes from 1 Samuel chapter 8. Where Israel is warned by Samuel that actions have consequences, and if you elect a king, if you insist on having a king instead of having God rule over you, then you will have a king who takes what he wants, who arrests and apprehends and intervenes, who murders and rapes, who exploits, because this is what power does. Now, I've often heard this passage preached, and I'm sure that you might have as well, to paint David as something of a fallen character, but one who is still in the service of a righteous and good God. And sometimes sermons that hinge on that focal point tend to end something like, God can use anyone to accomplish his will, even fallen kings such as David. We shouldn't be too concerned with David's faults, because God can even use the most fallible and the most faulted human beings. Now, of course that's true. But to only say that is to make light of the suffering of Uriah and all the men who died in battle with him. It is to make light of Bathsheba and her situation, who had no say and no choice in any of this. As we move into our story next week, we'll see that it makes light of 4 of David's sons that die as a consequence of his actions here. To simply end by saying God can use anyone to accomplish his will, even fallible, naughty King David, is to deny the utter tragedy and humanity in the story that is ripping families apart before our very eyes. And so, no, it's not good enough to only end there and only say God can use anyone. God can turn even the worst leaders into agents of his change. We must stand still and ask ourselves, at what cost are we proclaiming such things? At what cost are we so freely saying that just because God can use anyone, anything is permitted? Perhaps we're the ones who have become too accustomed to that absolutizing, corrupting, exploitative, all-encompassing power that makes it possible for those in power to get away with what they want, while those who are left lower down on the social hierarchy are trampled upon and exploited and crushed by those manifestations of power. Is there good news in today's sermon? I don't think so. But there is a very intriguing story. What I love about the Old Testament is that it confronts us, or rather, it asks us to confront in ourselves those very human characters who are so much like us, like our aunts and our uncles and our mothers and our fathers and our leaders and our coaches and our pastors and our prime ministers and our sisters and our brothers. What I love about the Old Testament is that we don't always need to find the moral lesson in the story. We just need to tell the story as truly as we can, without passing judgment, without thinking we need to right the wrongs of David, but simply saying that here we have recorded in the Bible, which is supposed to be this book about God's story with people, we have exactly a story about the worst kind of person. And lucky for us, and lucky for David, God isn't done with him yet. God doesn't leave him in that place where he is at his worst. Actions have consequences, and surely the whole of Israel and David himself will learn that the hard way. But somehow, in God's mysterious way, the story doesn't end. There's more to learn. There's more to discover. And I look forward to discovering more of what happens to David and his entire line in the next few weeks with you. Next week, the week after that, and the week after that. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God our Father and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with each of us, even as we read and are confronted by difficult scriptures. Amen.